Good afternoon. On behalf of the InterAmerican Development Bank, we welcome you to the event, Growth, Recovery, and Inclusion After COVID-19. This will be a conversation between IDB President Luis Alberto Moreno and the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. This event will be held in English and Spanish with interpretation. Please click on the world icon at the bottom of your screen and select the language of your preference. Before starting the conversation, we invite you to watch a presentation by Eric Parrado, IDB's Chief Economist and General Manager of the Research Department. Mr. Parrado, please go ahead.
Muchas gracias y muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a este nuevo evento.
Thank you and welcome to this event organized by the InterAmerican Development Bank. We're going to be talking about growth. And today we're going to have a great conversation between the Managing Director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, and the President of the IDB, Luis Alberto Moreno. But before they speak, I would like to share with you some thoughts about economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I am calling my mini presentation Growth, More Urgent Than Ever. It is important to grow for many different reasons, but the main reason is because it reduces poverty and inequality. Latin America has gained great strides in recent years, but it continues to be the most unequal region in the world. We represent growth represents two-thirds of the reduction in poverty. In just one decade, poverty went down by 12 percentage points with an accumulated level of 42%. Without growth, it will be impossible to continue to reduce poverty. This is important because the region came into the COVID emergency with serious problems. And beyond this situation, Latin America and the Caribbean have structural problems in terms of attaining sustainable growth. The region cannot get ahead in terms of its per capita income compared to the United States. It's a bit better than 2000. Here you can see the different growth, but it has been a slippage when compared to 1960. And this is in contrast to the upward steps of emerging Asia that then 1960 had 8.9% of the income and now has 50.9. So the region needs to grow, but it hasn't grown much in recent years, only 0.1% in 2009, very below the world average, which is 2.9%, or emerging Asia, 5.5%. Now, we weren't doing well, and then the pandemic hit. In 2020, the projections anticipate that the growth will be at minus 9.4%, the greatest loss in the world, and it would only recover partially by 2021. According to the projections, at the end of 2021, we will be 6% below where we were in 2018. That means 3 years lost of growth. But there's no reason for this to be the case. It wasn't always so. In the commodity boom, Latin America was growing at 5.6%, and that is something that we were not able to maintain. As the years went by, growth deteriorated until it became stalled in 2009. That means that the region didn't know how to use its boom. Public spending went up by more than 8% of GDP in those years, with very few results in terms of growth and equality. Now, based on our macro information, growth in the United States and China projected by the OECD, in case there is 1 or 2 waves of the pandemic, that means that there will be an 8 to 10% loss in the region of GDP. That means that the recovery could be U-shaped instead of V-shaped with devastating effects. We know that growth is essential to reduce poverty and inequality because Latin America and the Caribbean were stalled when the pandemic hit. But why have other regions done well and ours hasn't? To respond to that question, we have to look at the drivers of growth. Based on the work done at one of our macroeconomic reports and with our methodology of looking at priorities for productivity and income, we know that in Asia, half of the growth is due to improvements in productivity, whereas in LAC, there were losses in productivity. That comes away from growth. In Asia, there was a contribution in terms of productivity and capital. But if you separate out the countries of Latin America, you look at those that were able to go into a higher per capita income versus those that were not, you will see the differences that distinguish the two categories. So if you look at these structural effects, in addition to the effects of COVID-19, exactly what can we do so as to achieve growth, sustainable growth with equity? We cannot continue to do business as usual. We need to turn to business as unusual. So reforms are necessary and they're pressing. Let's not wait for another commodity boom. That may never come. The sources of growth have to come from domestic sources. They have to depend on us. And in a recent IDB report, we used an analogy of a tunnel where the region entered into that tunnel with a great deal of uncertainty in terms of how long the tunnel is. When will there be a vaccine? When will it be produced? How will it be distributed to our countries? But we are certain that the region will, on the other end, be more indebted, poorer, and more unequal. So how can we get out of that tunnel with inclusive growth? There are some things that the governments have on the radar, others not. For example, they understand the importance of avoiding job loss of household income, but that is not enough. Reform for greater future growth aren't on the radar yet, with very few exceptions. You could say that the context of the pandemic is not the best way or the best time to implement these reforms. But there is no ideal moment. But the urgency does exist. It is important to get out of this tunnel, accelerating our growth, and hence the need to reform today. And this requires a long-term view with a national consensus and a new social contract. We have the opportunity of creating a virtuous circle. We know that it's important to take health measures now, but many countries have fiscal problems, financing problems, and they are limited in terms of what they can do. But if the countries, even while they're in that tunnel, implement reforms to provide for reforms in the future, that will open access to credit and that will allow them to establish a virtuous cycle. Also, this will get rid of the default phantom because it will assure fiscal stability. And even if the region has not advanced in the reforms, we know what we have to do. Over the years, our banner reports, development in the Americas have addressed the different sectors that can contribute to growth. And for each sector, we have found recommendations that are practical policies that have an impact. I can give you some examples. For each 1% increase in savings, investment in the region could grow another 0.4%, contributing to growth. And second, if a person with secondary education joins a formal productive enterprise, the salary would go up 27% after several years versus 8% in an informal firm with low productivity. So third, an increase in public investment of 1% of GDP generates a long-term effect on GDP of up to 8%. And lastly, greater digitization of infrastructure services to improve productivity by 5%, along with good regulations creating competitive prices, can attain a 3.5% growth over several years. And I could give you countless examples in that direction. We know what we have to do. It's a long list, and there are important contributions for each issue. In the IDB, the research department has looked at potential reforms to strengthen growth. This was always important, but now they are more urgent than ever. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I concluded my presentation that way.
Welcome everybody, and especially to thank Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF. Let me briefly say I've had the privilege of knowing Kristalina from the day she was a commissioner in the European Union, but she, like us, understands emerging markets because she's come from one of them. And not only that, I've always watched her enormous interest in Latin America, and at the same time, her capacity to manage through crisis. So it's no surprise that she's been able to respond the way the IMF has responded to this huge crisis that we are all living because of COVID and all the consequences that it has. So let me just begin by welcoming Kristalina and talking about, you've talked about build forward better from this crisis. Now, after seeing what Eric just showed us, can Latin American economies do the same and emerge stronger after the pandemic? And is there an opportunity here for countries in the region to undertake some of those reforms that require and that are necessary and fundamental to have more inclusive growth?
Well, thank you very much, Luis Alberto, for having me as a guest for this discussion. You have been at the helm of the InterAmerican Development Bank for 15 years. You have built the capacity of the bank to effectively deliver for the region. And we can see this not only in terms of the projects and programs you support, the fact that you have a private sector arm with $7 billion investment in this year, but we just saw it also in the intellectual capacity that has been built to give the region a helpful direction, especially necessary in this time of uncertainty. So let me answer your question in three parts. First, to place it in the global context where we are today. We have been hit by the biggest shock of post-World War era. And I still remember February, March, the degree of unpredictability as to where the world economy is headed. Today, we can say that we are in a less bleak place. There are some early signs of recovery shooting, and the foundation for it is actually quite strong because it is synchronized action of governments and central banks on an incredible scale, unseen in our modern history, that put a floor under the world economy on which we can step. It is because countries have learned how to function with the pandemic still around us, and that applies, of course, also to Latin America. And it is because we now have some prospects for medical breakthrough. We can very clearly say, though, that not out of the woods, not at all. There is still a great degree of uncertainty. And it is absolutely critical to be focused first and foremost on a durable exit from the health-induced crisis. We have to be in a place where we can say with confidence that the pandemic is behind us. Second, the second point is very, very relevant for everyone. As we step on our feet, we need to remember that as long as this crisis is with that kind of uneven and partial recovery that we see around us, it is so very important to sustain support for households, for workers, for firms. And that is one thing I worry about at the IMF, that we might see premature withdrawal of support. Second, we look at the future, and we need to ask ourselves, in a crisis of that magnitude, that we have to get out of, we have to pour significant amount of fiscal stimulus, increase our debt levels. Are we going to do it just to restore the economy of yesterday, or we would do it to underpin the economy of tomorrow? Latin America is investing so far 8% of GDP as fiscal measures to support the economy. Okay, the first fiscal measures might have been to stop the bleeding. Now we have space for forward thinking. What is it that we want to accelerate? And the presentation talked about it, and I'll come to this point. I don't like much the phrase that is very popular these days, build back better, because I do believe we need to build forward to be where competition is going to lead to success tomorrow. And my third point is specifically for Latin America. We can think of the region as one that has all kinds of problems, which is true. Low productivity, low growth. Before the pandemic, that is where we were. Still very big informal sector with improvements in inequality, improvements in education, quantitatively, but not yet qualitatively, not yet education that is a accelerator of productivity. And with countries at different stages of having domestic issues in terms of debt and deficit. And of course, we know some countries are with very severe problems. Or we can think of the region as a region with underutilized potential. And I want to bring 4 points, and then we would come, I'm sure, in the discussion to those. One is what was presented just right now. The decade of commodity prices giving a boost to Latin America have not translated into massively investing in human capital, in infrastructure for competitiveness, and in business environment that is conducive for the dynamism of private sector-led growth. It hasn't happened. Hasn't happened doesn't mean cannot happen. And I think this is probably the biggest opportunity for Latin America to just do what should have been done before under the pressure of this crisis. Secondly, Latin America is not where it could be in terms of digitalization. Actually, there are patches in Latin America that are doing very well, but overall, huge space for moving towards the digital economy. And given how many geographical obstacles there is for connectivity, just by the virtue of the terrain in Latin America, digitalization is a huge boost. Digitalization can do a hugely important service to the people in Latin America by putting governance on a different foundation. If we go e-government, then the citizen is in charge. Then we have transparency of decision-making. Many of the entitlements of the problems that are holding growth back in Latin America are going to be gone. Latin America has such a rich environment, low carbon, climate resilient, biodiversity-based growth is a huge opportunity for Latin America. And last but not least, the capacity for trading with each other, integrating more. Mercosur can take off much more forcefully than it has done before. And you and I were talking about that before we started. In my part of the world, in Europe, Central Eastern Europe, integrated in the European Union with huge diversity, language diversity of countries. And Latin America has this privilege. You have Spanish, you have Portuguese, you have English. You have much more homogeneity that potentially for this economic integration that can, this is one piece that I didn't hear in the presentation. I think it is a fabulous opportunity. I cannot think of a better time than a crisis to move forward. There is no better time. I would finish with something you said in the beginning. I come from an emerging market. My country, Bulgaria, in the 90s, went through a devastating crisis. An old economic model, central planning, collapsed. I saw my mother losing her life savings to hyperinflation virtually within days. I still remember getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to queue to buy milk for my daughter. But that was the crisis that pushed Bulgaria to reform. And we are now in, you showed the graph, we saw the graph. This part of the world that is more dynamic, you talked about Asia, but the same applies to Central and Eastern Europe. What they are now, what they have become, this is what Latin America can do. And I think a new social compact that gives young people of Latin America that sense of opportunity can be a key to much needed success.
Well, these are all great points, and I want to try to take many of them and perhaps drill down on them. You mentioned something that is critical, and you said it over and over again, is that until there is a sense of stability, governments have no choice but to continue putting, as you call it, that floor under which you can stand up, and that means largely both monetary, but especially fiscal stimulus. Mm. And as you correctly said, there's a number of countries in Latin America who already had, high debt issues. That is something that the fund constantly is looking, especially at debt sustainability. Mm. How are you seeing this for the region? And how are you thinking about that very difficult balance between supporting lives and livelihoods?
Well, the picture in Latin America, the same way the picture in the world is very diverse. There are countries that have done really well in leaning forward with substantial stimulus. Brazil is a very good example, has done quite a lot. And it has done it in a way that is a good lesson for everybody. The Corona vouchers, and then targeting support for workers so there is no massive unemployment. That is the kind of good examples we want to see spreading. We also have seen another very important lesson. It's like you put it as a earring on your ear. Countries with strong fundamentals are weathering the crisis better. Countries that have more holistic approach to how they underpin growth, take Uruguay, almost universal healthcare, well organized, well disciplined in response to crisis. These countries do better. And then you see on the other side, end of the spectrum, the same way the virus hits people with pre-existing conditions the hardest, economies with pre-existing conditions are much more severely hit. Argentina, Ecuador, you see that lesson from the crisis that you work towards sound fundamentals. They help you in good times. They save you in bad times. That is something that we have to take on board. What does it mean? Immediately, right now, it is really paramount not to pull the plug on support. And as you know, Luis Alberto, from the IMF, we ourselves are leaning forward in this crisis. We have provided emergency financing in different forms and policy support to 17 countries in Latin America. We also provided 3 countries, Peru, Chile, and a renewal Colombia, with flexible credit lines. Good fundamentals, you reinforce them. Countries with really difficult time to pay the bills that keep that floor stable. For those, we extended emergency financing. While you're doing that, while you're taking advantage of the existence of a global financial safety net, we are part of it, you're part of it, countries need to start thinking how to get to fiscal consolidation over medium term, how to inject more growth momentum, and obviously clean up the obstacles to growth. This is like the #1 action that needs to be taken. And then also how you restructure your taxation for the 21st century. It doesn't apply just for Latin America. It is also obvious in some countries in Latin America that revenues are not necessarily tapping into where the capacity to pay is highest, and expenditures are not necessarily used in a most productive way. We still have harmful subsidies that benefit rich people. That now is the time to clean this up. So you think about 2-3 years down the road, you come on a much stronger foundation. I am not excluding the necessity to look into debt sustainability in some cases. As we all know, there have been 2 successful debt restructurings already, Ecuador and Argentina. We have to be watchful, but most important policy advice from the fund is concentrate on how you can boost growth by taking the structural reform measures that have not been taken during the days of the commodity boom, and think how you would revamp your fiscal situation in a way that reflects what is going to be a fruitful space. Some countries certainly have space for more progressive taxation. Many countries have space to improve tax collection. Many countries have space to improve the quality of expenditures. Now is the time to think how to do all this as we get on the other side of this crisis.
Those are hugely important points that you mentioned in terms of taxation, because, and I'm sure you at the fund are thinking about this, because it's going to be a challenge the world over. I mean, the reality is that this huge, massive fiscal stimulus is going to have to be mopped up, and eventually governments are going to have to work in the 3 different directions that you were mentioning, around basically efficiency of taxation, efficiency in the way that those rates are captured, but equally how expenditures are done. But let's talk about something you raised at the beginning, which I know it's very dear to your heart. And it's something that you just alluded to, and it's everything around productivity and human capital. I know that, investing in people has always been a key priority to you. And, tell us a little bit about how you see this play out in Latin America. Where do you see, because as you were alluding to, we got to think not only building back better necessarily, but in rebuilding towards the future. This becomes a central element, especially when the world is more and more dependent on services, perhaps less on manufacturing. Much of that new employment is going to require a specific kind of skills. Tell us how you're thinking about this.
But let me first say that Latin America has done quite a lot to recognize investment in human capital. There is almost universal access to primary education somewhere, secondary education. There is a recognition that social protection matters. Many countries in Latin America have improved their social safety nets. We now, with this crisis, even more recognize the importance of access to healthcare. I actually hope that I mentioned Uruguay, universal access to health coverage. I hope this would become the acceptable norm. Where there is a lot that can be still done is in, I would stress two areas. The first one is quality of education. In my former institution, the World Bank is calculating learning, a very important indicator, learning adjusted school years. You may go to school for 12 years, but you learn the equivalent of 7. So it's not a big advantage for competitiveness. And that emphasis on quality not only applies to quality in public versus private schools, it applies everywhere. I was looking at the PISA rankings. Some countries in Latin America have improved, but overall, if you look at the world, Asia is in the lead. To a certain degree, Europe, Canada, Latin America is not quite yet there. And by the way, my own country is not quite there. So it's not don't take this as a criticism. Countries have to focus, they have to zero on this quality of education very big time. We are moving in a knowledge-based economy. You don't have the foundation for it. You're not resilient. You're not resilient as an individual, as a community, as a country. So that focus on quality and actually looking at where Singapore is, I want to be Singapore. Give Singapore eventually a run for their money. There has to be ambition for that, because if we are in a fast moving world and you adjust, you're adaptable, if you have that quality learning, not just schooling, but learning and adaptability that comes with it. And secondly, I think the problem of what skills are being nurtured, it's quite severe. So you look at the youth, say young people in Chile, they go to school, they go to university, and then they go out and there is nothing. So how can we think much more seriously about what are the skills, how much vocational training there is, how much you emphasize on what the market is likely to call, and how do you drag private sector to be part of the solution? If your private sector is paying a lot for skills very actively, not for the workers they hire, but for the quality of the labor force, we're in a better place. And we see countries being competitive when they do that. And I would say for Latin America, the positive energy that comes from youthful societies, it has to be translated into not just diplomas, but into entrepreneurship and jobs. And I probably should give more of a shout out for creating entrepreneurial environment, and for something that the presentation has shown very clearly, moving the economy more into formality, but formality that is dynamic. I mean, labor regulations in Latin America kind of stagnated. Business environment, not the focus always of attention. Well, that changes, you unleash this incredible dynamism that smart young people in Latin America can bring for themselves and for their countries.
You know, let's pick up on this whole private sector idea, because as you were mentioning, clearly we're in a moment where both the private sector and governments have to be on the same side of the table. looking to resolve equally the kinds of challenges that are coming as a result of COVID. How are you thinking of the private sector from the perspective of the fund, which is not only what you would look at, you look, of course, at the financial issues, but how are you thinking about the kinds of things, these new realities in front of us, challenge the private sector in ways that perhaps they've never seen before?
I mean, when you look at this crisis, very clearly there are parts of the economy that are big winners. The digital economy, big winner. The high-tech, big winner. And the innovation space, digital solutions, digital payments, e-commerce, all of this has moved. It was on the go, and it has accelerated tremendously. So that part of private sector is one that enjoys this dynamism, but not necessarily is brought into what are the opportunities and solutions, how we share our future, what do we do for those that are falling behind. Then we have private sector that are in industries that are going to be quite severely impacted. Some of the contact dependent industries, we don't know where they would come on the other side. We also have the high carbon intensity industries. They're going to be faced with a very difficult adjustment for the future. So I think getting a conversation in which there is this sense of common future and more of looking at how we can support the transition with the private sector voices being heard. One of the best things I heard from a private sector representative in this crisis was the following. In a massive transformation like the one we are experiencing, what used to be perceived as possible only as incremental improvements, all of a sudden is open for radical change. And that is going to be happening. Our problem is going to be how to keep private sector involved so that radical change does not expand the accordion of inequality in society, but actually helps us to bring everybody forward. And I would really hope to see the private sector engaged in defining this future of less inequality, because one of the things we know from pandemics of this last decade, from H1N1, from Zika, from SARS, after a pandemic, inequality expands. Now, this is a gigantic pandemic. The risk of that expansion is huge. I cannot imagine us preventing that risk unless the private sector is included with that sense of social responsibility in its own interest, in the interest of having social cohesion that helps our countries, our economies, our societies for the future. Let's remember, 2019, it was not a non-problematic year. We had anemic growth, low productivity, and protests erupting everywhere, mostly because of this sense of lack of opportunity. Now, we move forward. That has to be a huge part of this building forward better agenda. And the private sector has to be part of it. They're not just job creators. They're also very important social stability actors if they're part of that solution. So bringing business, government, the citizens together is going to be absolutely, absolutely essential.
You know, you mentioned inequality, and that's such a huge issue. You know, we've had inequality in Latin America forever, and that to an extent explains a lot of the populism that basically breeds off of inequality. In fact, if just looking at the crisis, 70% of the individuals in the poorest quintile have lost their job as opposed to 20% in the upper quintile. So these issues of inequality are going to be at the center. And as you correctly say, the private sector is going to be critical. I just wanted to ask something that you mentioned at the beginning, and you and I had the chance yesterday in another webinar to talk about this. But you mentioned the richness of our natural capital, the biodiversity that exists in Latin America, and you put that as a source of growth. Talk to us a little bit more about that, because I know that you at the fund have been constantly looking at all the ways to begin to value natural capital, to think of creative ideas around dead to nature swaps, which were done in the past. Tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about this.
The foundation for this is a very simple understanding that what underpins growth are human capital, physical capital, natural capital, and institutional capital, if you wish, the governance capacity. You have to build your growth agenda taking care of investing in all forms of capital. And we are now at the point when we recognize that the speed with which we are depleting natural capital, the speed with which we are accelerating climate change, puts not just our economies, and they are at risk, it puts our existence at risk. So looking into the Latin American rich natural capital, one has to think about ways in which it is being not just nurtured, but also deployed, and how we can get an old concept in which we ask the world to help Latin America protect something that is serving the world. I think this is a good moment to think about it. And of course, they're valuing the different elements of natural capital is fundamental to make good investments in it. And I think we will see the way the discussion around the future of growth goes. I hope this would be a big part of it. Remarkably, climate change is turning into even higher top of mind concern. There were people who were saying, now we entered the pandemic, nobody's going to care about climate. But the opposite is happening. The pandemic made us sober about the force of nature, the shocks nature can cause. And it is actually what I see in conversations with private sector leaders, with civil society, actions of politicians, it is actually picking up. And I hope Latin America is going to grab that moment. We saw the European Union putting 37% of their pandemic crisis stimulus, dealing with the crisis stimulus, for green investments. We have seen them actually increasing their commitment to emission reduction. They were saying we would go 50%, now they're lifting it up to 55%. Now is the moment to embrace something that would put also Latin America in a lead position. And if I may, I know we're close to exhausting our time, but Latin America has to look at what are the new opportunities. I think green is not new, but it is highly reinforced as an opportunity. The reshuffle of global value chains that is going to be happening for Latin America, it is an opportunity as the United States and others are adjusting. Can the region take advantage of this opportunity? One has to be thinking in a way that the impossible in a moment like this becomes possible, and then pursue it.
Kristalina, certainly one of the areas that I'm sure you ask often about is, here you are all of a sudden, within less than a year we're coming in, the numbers of countries going to the IMF simply exploded. You've been able to solve, as you said at the beginning, a lot of them in Latin America. But clearly there's a big question of, on all international financial institutions, are we going to be able to deploy the level of resources that countries are going to need? And of course, no institution is more important than the IMF to have the kind of firepower to create the kinds of stability and the ground, as you were saying earlier. How are you looking in terms of creating more of that financial firepower to create the level of stability and the ground under which we are all going to stand and eventually grow?
We have been fortunate that after the global financial crisis, the membership decided that the fund needs to be strengthened in terms of lending capacity. I started in October last year, wrapping up an agreement that allows us to have up to $1 trillion of lending capacity. Out of this 1 trillion, we have deployed so far 270 billion, about 1/3 in the last months because of this crisis. We have responded to 76 emergency financing requests, lifelines for countries, and we have also done our more traditional lending on a larger scale. So we still have a lot of firing power. We will continue to monitor, is that enough? For now, because of the enormous injection of liquidity from central banks and fiscal authorities, money is available for countries with good fundamentals, they can borrow. Our concentration is on low-income countries and countries with no access to markets. And there we are increasing our concessional lending capacity. For poor countries, this is a must. We are also looking for ways to reduce the debt burden on poor countries. You know of the debt service suspension initiative. It benefits some of the countries in Latin America. And what we want is to continue to carefully monitor, are financial conditions tightening? And if so, what does that mean for our action? But for now, I can say, I can look people in the eye and I can say we are there for you. And actually, as we are coming to the end of our conversation, you have been 15 years at the helm of a very important institution. What is your biggest takeaway? And actually, what is your advice to me as we are navigating this chopped waters?
Well, thank you very much, Kristalina, for that. Oh, 15 years, a lot has happened, as you know. I came to the IDB at a time when growth seemed that it was just simply exploding. It was the boom of the commodities. It was helping Latin American countries in a big way. There was a big discussion at the time if multilateral institutions were needed, given this huge amount of liquidity, and only to find literally 5 years later that we were in the midst of a financial crisis, which basically brought a total rethink on what to do. But my take is, what really is important in any endeavor that you do in life is you're as good as the team that you're able to assemble. So I was very lucky to get a top-notch team that were creating a true meritocracy, bringing the best minds to the service of Latin America. Secondly, kind of taking some of these emerging issues that were not there as prevalent 15 years ago, such as climate change and the whole question of sustainable development, the whole question of digitalization. I mean, Latin America, when you look back in history, it lost the train of the Industrial Revolution, but it cannot lose the train of the digital revolution. And certainly, if anything has happened with COVID, is that it has accelerated just that. But we were much, very ready for dealing with this, in working with countries in the expansion of bandwidth, using through all of our programs applications that use digital technologies, and it's something that is the whole staff is very conversant. Equally, the private sector. I feel very proud of what we've been able to do with IDB Invest, because I believe that more and more as you correctly pointed out, it is going to be hand in hand, the private sector and governments, where they're going to have to find the solution towards the future. And we have a very strong IDB Invest today that can respond to that. And equally, you know, we are complex institutions in that we are owned by many governments, and balancing those needs of the different governments is not only an art form, but at the end of the day, you can begin to use all of that energy in a positive way and bring the best out of all the partners to support your development goal. And that means working everybody, regardless of what a country or a difference ideologically or politically. Development doesn't have a color. Development is about bringing people out of poverty, bringing people into have really an improvement of their lives. And there is no political color towards that. So using all of that energy towards that direction is, to me, one of the most important things. And I hope that in all of these years, we were able to do just that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I recognize my responsibilities in what you're saying to a very high degree, bringing everybody together with unity of purpose, so we can help our membership to be more resilient in a more shock-prone future, societies to be more vibrant, to have more opportunities, and ultimately to see lives of people improving. This is what has driven you for 15 years. This is what drives me in my job. So I just want to thank you for our wonderful collaboration over these years and wish you all the very best.
Well, thank you very much, Kristalina, and it's been always a privilege talking with you, and I learned a lot from you all over these years, and I know you will continue to do great things, and I really thank you for your time. I know normally you would have been spending 60+% of your time going around the world. Today you are doing much more intensive. I've talked to you weekends, days, every time, and you're constantly out there. So thank you very much. I think this is a moment where, you know, people look up to people like yourself, and we need to communicate more. Our staff needs to hear more of us, and so we gotta be out there all the time. And congratulations for what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A great afternoon. Bye bye. Thank you.